the cursed mirror cracked down the center. The moment Gideon Mirev looked into it, and what it showed him made even a 500-year-old vampire go completely, devastatingly still, not a battlefield, not his enemies, not the ancient court that had been hunting him across 3 centuries. It showed him Lenora Belmont, kneeling on cold stone, blood at her temple, her dark eyes open and glassy, with the particular stillness that only death could produce. The mirror had never been wrong. That was the terrible, unforgiving truth about the Severance Glass, a relic older than most living vampire dynasties, forged in the court of the Vethrani bloodline during the Age of Binding. It did not show possibilities. It did not show fears merely to torment. It showed what would come to pass if nothing changed. And nothing changed, and nothing changed. It was not prophecy. It was a verdict. Gideon stood in the lower level of Mirev House, a 3-story Victorian mansion buried beneath the financial district of modern Chicago. Its upper floors is accessible through a private elevator, disguised as a parking authority service door. The mansion existed in a pocket of the city that had been bought, bribed, and carefully ignored for a century and a half. Above him, the city breathed its ordinary human breath. Below him, in the chamber of glass, the Severance mirror stood in its iron frame and showed him the worst thing he had ever seen. He had not moved in 4 minutes. Then he noticed the detail that the mirror had included in the reflection, the detail that changed everything about the reading. Lenora was already there. In the mirror's surface, standing behind her dying form, was Lenora herself. Alive, awake, her physician's coat still pristine despite the chaos of the room around her. She was standing in the reflection, looking directly back at him, not at the mirror. At him, the mirror showed his worst fear, and the human doctor was already standing in the reflection, watching it happen with the steady, furious calm of someone who refused to let that outcome stand. Gideon had met Lenora Belmont exactly 19 days ago. She had come into his world sideways and without apology, the way certain humans did who had no idea what they were walking into and therefore feared nothing. It was a Tuesday evening when his Gesart, Vaska, had brought her in from the rain. Vaska was ancient even by vampire standards, white-haired to the point of silver blue, his cheekbones as sharp as old architecture, his manner as formal as a sealed letter. He did not retrieve people from rainstorms. He had done it once in all his centuries. This once, Lenora had been treating a man in an alley behind the Green Line on 51st Street. The man was one of Gideon's, a lower court member named Dresh, who had been caught in a skirmish with the Vethrani scouts and taken 3 wounds that no human medic's understanding could explain. Lenora had not been a passerby. She was a trauma surgeon at the University of Chicago Medical Center, doing unsanctioned volunteer street medicine on her nights off because, as she would later tell Gideon without a trace of apology, the hospital system failed people and someone had to pick up the slack. She had already identified that Dresh's wounds were unlike anything in a standard medical text. She had treated him anyway, applying pressure, calling for the specific supplies she kept in the battered bag over her shoulder, keeping him alive purely through the force of her competence and refusal to stop. Vaska had found her with her hands in the wound and her jaw set like iron. He had brought her in because the alternative was letting Dresh die in the street, and because Vaska, for all his centuries of cold court maneuvering, recognized courage when it stood in the rain and refused to leave. Gideon had walked into the chamber of his own estate to find a human woman in a physician's coat, instructing his immortal household staff on how to assist a surgical procedure with the authority of someone who owned the room. She had not looked up at him when he entered. She had said, without breaking her attention from her patient, "If you're in charge here, I need to know his full history, all of it, including whatever you're not going to tell me, because I sensed in the wound profile." He had stood in the doorway of his own home, 523 years old, one of 4 remaining Mirev bloodline leaders, feared across 3 vampire courts and 2 continents, and he had been completely disarmed, he told her. Not everything, not immediately, but he told her enough: the vampire physiology, the accelerated cellular decay that came from Vethrani-laced blades, the specific counter-treatment. She had listened without flinching, asked 3 sharp and brilliant follow-up questions, adjusted her approach, and saved Dresch's life before midnight. Then she had sat down in his kitchen, accepted the cup of coffee Vaska inexplicably produced, and looked at Gideon with those dark, measuring eyes, and said, "I'm going to need you to explain the rest of it." He should have sent her home with a carefully applied memory adjustment, the standard protocol for human exposure. It was not a violation of blood law to alter the memory of an uninvited witness. It was, in fact, required by the ancient codes of concealment. The Compact of Shadows, established in 1887 between the major courts and a consortium of old-world human societies, demanded it. Any human who encountered verifiable vampire evidence was to be either brought into formal contract with the court or have the memory addressed within 24 hours. He had 24 hours. He had sat down across from her, looked at the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, and waited for him without flinching, and decided he did not want to adjust her memory. He told Vaska to draw up a formal visitor's contract instead. It was a lesser-used provision of the compact, originally designed for human scholars, alchemists, and later certain physicians who provided services too valuable to silence. A contracted visitor was bound to silence by blood-sealed agreement, and offered the protection of the court in exchange. It was not common. It required the signature of a court principal, meaning Gideon himself. It also meant that whatever happened to Lenora Belmont from that moment forward was his direct responsibility under blood law. He had signed it without hesitation. She had read every clause, asked for 2 modifications, negotiated them successfully, and then signed it herself, with the calm precision of someone who had reviewed complicated contracts before. "You do understand," Gideon had said that first night, "that this places you under my protection, formally, which means my enemies become yours. I'm a trauma surgeon in Chicago," she had said, meeting his gaze with that maddening steadiness. "I already have difficult nights." 19 days later, standing before a cracked mirror that showed her death, he understood that he had been falling in love with her since the moment he saw her refuse to leave a dying man in the rain. He turned away from the mirror and walked directly to the secure channel that connected him to Vaska. "Find her," he said. "Now. Don't let her out of the building until I reach her." The problem was that Lenora was not in his building. She was at the hospital. The Vethrani had known that. The Vethrani had known everything, it turned out, which meant that someone in Gideon's court was feeding them intelligence, and the mirror had told him only the outcome, not the name of the traitor. Vaska's voice came back tight and controlled, which for Vaska was the equivalent of panic. "She left 40 minutes ago. Emergency dispatch called her in for a multi-vehicle accident on the Dan Ryan. She went. She did not call for an escort. She does not always call for an escort. She is supposed to always call for an escort. Gideon was already moving, already pulling on the coat that hung by the chamber door, already calculating the distance between Mirev House and the University of Chicago Medical Center on the map that lived inside a 5-century-old mind. Who in this house knew she was going out? Silence on the line. Then, that is the question I am also asking. Ask it faster, Vaska. He moved through the lower levels with the particular speed that his kind called the glide, something between running and the erasure of distance, which translated to a human observer as something deeply wrong with the laws of physics. He was in the elevator before the thought to be in the elevator had finished forming. He was on street level before the city noise registered. Chicago in January was brutal and dark and beautiful, the lake, wind cutting through the financial district like a judgment. The streets were wet and lit in orange from the high-pressure sodium lamps, the kind of ugly industrial light that made everything look like a crime scene. He moved through it without bothering to look human about the speed. The hospital was 4 miles south. He covered it in 7 minutes. He did not enter through the emergency department. He entered through the rooftop access that he had keyed to his biometrics 18 days ago, because he was not a man who left things to chance. With the particular knowledge that came from 5 centuries of watching the world try to destroy everything he valued, that Lenora Belmont was going to need him to be able to reach her quickly. She was in Trauma Bay 3. She did not know he was there for the first 4 minutes because she was actively running a resuscitations on one of the accident victims, her hands moving with that precise, furious grace that he had come to think of as her most essential characteristic. He stood just inside the doorway and watched the room with his full attention, cataloguing every exit, every face, every anomaly, and there were 2 anomalies. The first was the man in scrubs near the back wall, who was not doing anything medically useful, and whose heartbeat was running at the elevated but controlled rate of someone who was maintaining a pretense. Gideon clocked him as a Vethrani infiltrator within 4 seconds. The second was the IV bag on the far counter that had been prepared but not yet used, which smelled wrong, which smelled of something that had no place in a hospital. It smelled of Vethrani preparation compounds, substances that interacted with vampire physiology in specific and catastrophic ways, or in large enough concentrations with any physiology. The man in scrubs was not here for Gideon. He was here for Lenora. The blood law of the Vethrani court was ancient and brutal and specific. Under their code, any human who entered into formal protection contract with a rival court principal became, in the Vethrani interpretation, a weapon. Destroying a principal's contracted human was not murder under their statutes. It was strategic asset denial. It was completely legal by the rules of a court that had written its own laws to justify everything it wanted to do anyway. Gideon crossed the room in a single movement no human eye in that space could have tracked. He had the man by the wrist before the IV bag reached the hook it was being aimed at. He said, very quietly, into the infiltrator's ear, "You have approximately 3 seconds to convince me not to remove your arm." The man said nothing. His heartbeat spiked. His other hand went for something in his waistband, but Gideon was already there, already relieving him of it, a vial that he recognized, a contact compound that Vethrani operatives used for field terminations. Lenora had turned around. She saw Gideon. She saw the man he was holding. She saw the vial. She looked at all of it with those dark eyes and said, in a voice that was absolutely steady, "What do I need to know right now?" "He was going to put something in your IV," Gideon said. Not the patient's, yours. A pause that lasted exactly one breath. Then, is the patient safe? He had not expected that to be her first question. He should have. Yes. This was targeted at you specifically. All right. She looked at the rest of her team. Martinez, Chowdhury, I need you to take over in here. Full protocol, nothing from that counter. Her eyes went to the counter with the wrong-smelling bag. Nothing from that station at all, do you understand? Flag it for biohazard review. She was already untying her surgical apron. She walked to Gideon the way someone walks to a trusted partner in a crisis, directly, without hesitation, and said quietly, "We need to go." "Yes," he agreed. They left through the service corridor, Gideon keeping his hand on the infiltrator's arm, until they were in the stairwell, at which point he applied pressure to a specific cluster of nerves behind the man's jaw that rendered him unconscious without permanent damage. Because Gideon was going to have questions for him later, and questions required a living subject, he lowered the man to the landing. Lenora looked at the unconscious form, then at Gideon. Will he survive that? He will wake up with a headache and an excellent opportunity to reconsider his career choices. Good. She pushed open the stairwell door. Now explain to me why the Vithrani are coming after me. Directly, he had told her about the Vithrani 14 days ago during one of the evenings she had taken to spending at Mirev House, ostensibly reviewing medical data on vampire physiology that she was carefully keeping in encrypted personal files, practically because both of them had begun inventing reasons to be in the same room. He had explained the Vithrani court, their claim to continental dominance, their 3-century conflict with the Mirev bloodline, their particular interpretation of blood law that made them simultaneously ancient and monstrous. She had catalogued all of it with the same attention she gave to medical literature. Now, moving through the hospital's service levels toward the rooftop exit, he told her the rest.
"You are my contracted human," he said. "Under the old codes, that makes you an asset of my court."
The Vithrani do not recognize the Compact of Shadows provisions that protect contracted humans. They recognize only their own statutes. Under their law, you are a legitimate target. And under your law, under my law, you are protected absolutely. He paused at a corner, assessed the corridor, moved. Under my honor, you are protected with everything I have. She was quiet for a moment as they climbed. Then, that's the first time you've said honor instead of law. He held the rooftop door open for her. The January wind came through with teeth. They are not always the same thing, he said. She looked at him across the cold air of the hospital rooftop, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her physician's coat catching the light from the city below. She was 32 years old and had spent 10 of those years becoming brilliant at keeping people alive. She looked at him like she was weighing something, and then she said, "The mirror, the Severance Glass. You told me about it when we went over the Mirev historical archives. You said it showed worst fears." He had told her more than was strictly necessary about his court's history. He had told her because she asked questions that deserved real answers, and because he was discovering that there was a particular pleasure in being fully honest with someone who was capable of handling the full truth. "It cracked tonight," he said. Her expression changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical alarm of someone performing a reaction, with the subtle shift of someone absorbing information that matters. "Before or after you sent Vasca to find me?" "Before, immediately before. What did it show you?" The wind moved between them. Below, the city was indifferent and vast. "You," he said, "dead." She held his gaze, did not look away, did not make it easier for either of them by deflecting. And I was already standing in the reflection. Yes, which means the mirror was showing the outcome if nothing changes. But it also showed that I was there, conscious, watching it, which means there's something I can do to prevent it. He had reached the same conclusion himself, but hearing it from her, articulated with that swift, clean logic, did something to him that he did not have a comfortable word for. Yes. Then we need to figure out what I need to do. She crossed her arms against the cold, practical as always. And who in your court is talking to the Vethrani? He looked at her. She met his eyes without blinking. That's the only way they could have known I was going to the hospital tonight. I got a call. I didn't tell anyone except Vaska. And I didn't announce it on any communication channel your court monitors. Someone who knew my habits. Someone who knew that I would go alone. Someone who knew that a trauma call was the one thing that would get me out without an escort. I had reached the same conclusion, he said quietly. Who has that much access to information about me? Fewer than 12 people in my court. I am already reviewing that number. She nodded once. Then she shivered, because she was a human being in a physician's coat in January on a rooftop in Chicago, and she was made of flesh and blood and needed warmth, and he stepped forward and put his coat around her shoulders before the thought had finished forming, and she let him. And for a moment they were very close together, and neither of them moved away. Gideon, she said, her voice quieter than it had been. Lenora, tell me the rest of what the mirror showed. He breathed in the cold air that she did not need to breathe, and looked at the city over her head and said, it showed a room I did not recognize, stone floor, very old architecture, Vethrani style, and you were kneeling, and there was blood at your temple, and your eyes were open and still. She was quiet for a long moment. And I was standing behind myself, looking at you. Yes, that's not how the mirror usually works, is it? No, the Severance Glass shows outcomes, not observers. It is not meant to include a living figure watching from within the vision. That has never been recorded in any account of the glass in the Mirev archives. So it was showing you something different, not just what would happen. What I would be capable of doing if you brought me into it. He looked down at her, this extraordinary human woman who had read 300-year-old vampire court documents and extracted their logical implications in under 20 seconds. I believe that is correct. Then bring me in, she said simply. All the way in, no more pieces. I need the full picture. He took her back to Mirev House. Not in the way he had arrived, not at the speed that erased distance, because she was with him, and he would not frighten her with the full expression of what he was. He had a car, of course, a car with reinforced windows, and a driver who was one of his oldest loyalties, a vampire named Saurin, who had been with the Mirev bloodline for 200 years, and drove modern vehicles with the focused attention of someone who still found them slightly miraculous. In the back of the car, moving through the orange-lit streets, he told her everything. The Vethrani court was led by a principal named Dravek Sor, an ancient and genuinely dangerous intellect who had decided, approximately 80 years ago, that the old compact of shadows was an obstacle rather than an agreement, and had been working since then to dismantle it one provision at a time. The compact was what kept vampire courts from operating openly against human infrastructure. Without it, the careful centuries-long balance between the supernatural world and the human one would collapse, and the result would be a war that neither side could survive intact. Gideon had been one of the primary obstacles to Sor's long campaign. The Mirev bloodline held significant formal power within the structure of the Compact's governing council, the Conclave of Seals, and as long as a Mirev principal occupied a conclave seat, Saw could not push through the legislative changes he needed. Lenora listened to all of it and said, "So it's not really about blood law or personal vendetta. It's about removing a political obstacle. It is both. Saw and the Mirev line have genuine ancient enmity. But yes, the political dimension is the more immediate motive. And by coming after me, he is trying to destabilize you personally before a formal political move. The conclave convenes in 11 days. There is a vote scheduled on the compact renewal. If Saw can present evidence that a Mirev principle has failed to protect a contracted human, it invalidates my conclave seat under the old codes. I would be required to abstain from the vote, and the compact renewal would fail." She turned to look at him in the dark of the moving car, her face lit in passing intervals of orange. "So if I die, you lose your seat, Saw gets his vote, and the compact fails. And if I live," he looked at her, "if you live," he said, "and the conclave vote succeeds, the compact is renewed for another century, the balance holds, and Saw loses the opportunity he has spent 8 decades building toward." She turned back to the window. He watched her think. He had learned the particular quality of her thinking in these 19 days, the way it was visible in the set of her jaw and the stillness she went into when something significant was assembling itself in her mind. "There is an obvious question," she said. "Yes. If I cancel the contracted visitor agreement, withdraw from your protection formally, then my death or survival becomes legally neutral under the blood codes. Saw loses his lever. Your conclave seat is safe regardless of what happens to me. That is correct. Have you considered asking me to do that?" "No." She turned to look at him again. "Why not?" He held her gaze in the intermittent light. He was 523 years old, and he had watched dynasties rise and crumble, and he had made decisions that shaped centuries. And he looked at this human woman of 32 and told her the honest truth. "Because I would rather lose the conclave seat." The car was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant admission," she said softly. "I am aware of that." She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands that had been inside wounds tonight and had saved people, and she said without looking up, "I'm not going to cancel the agreement. Lenora, I'm not because I don't understand the political logic, but because I'm not going to make myself politically safe by removing myself from your protection. That is not the solution here." She looked up. "The solution is stopping Saw. Stopping Saw directly is extraordinarily dangerous. I know. Tell me how." He leaned back. He looked at the ceiling of the car. He thought about the mirror and the image of her standing behind her own fallen body, and the expression on her reflected face, which had been furious and determined and directed at him like a challenge. "The Conclave of Seals has a provision," he said, "called the Declarance of Challenge. It is very old, rarely invoked. Under the Declarance, any principal who can present evidence of deliberate bad faith manipulation of the compact codes can bring a formal challenge against another principal's court. If the challenge is upheld by a majority of conclave members, the offending court loses its seat, not merely its vote, permanently. And Saw sending an operative to poison me in a hospital is deliberate, bad faith manipulation of the compact codes. It is. But I need evidence that is admissible under conclave rules. The operative I left unconscious in the stairwell is one piece, but I need the chain of command. I need documentation of the order, and I need the name of my court's traitor, because without closing that leak, Saw will always be one step ahead. They arrived at Mirev House. Vaska was waiting in the entrance hall with an expression that managed to convey both profound relief and deeply controlled anger simultaneously. He took one look at Lenora and said, with the grave formality of 2 centuries of court protocol, "I am glad you are unharmed. Thank you, Vaska," she said, with the warmth she always showed him. A warmth that he had never quite known how to receive and which had resulted in Vaska inexplicably learning her coffee preferences. "We have work to do." The traitor was found in 4 hours. It was not a betrayal born of ideology or ancient allegiance to a rival bloodline, which would have been cleaner, more understandable within the codes. It was simpler and uglier than that. The lower court member who had been feeding Lenora's schedule to the Vethrani was a young vampire 2 centuries old, barely old enough to be called settled into his nature, named Perovich, who had been gambling his court obligations against Vethrani. Vethrani coin, he had not thought of Lenora as a person. He had thought of her as information. Gideon handled that himself in a conversation that lasted 20 minutes and did not require physical violence, because Gideon had always found that the truly devastating confrontations were conducted entirely in words. Perovich would be remanded to the Conclave's compact court, which handled internal violations and would serve the institutional equivalent of a very long exile. The operative from the hospital woke up with Vaska watching him, which Gideon suspected was profoundly more intimidating than waking up with Gideon present. Vaska had a way of sitting perfectly still that communicated tremendous possibility of consequence. The operative talked. He gave them Saw's operational chain. He gave them the documentation pathway. He was frightened in the specific way that someone is frightened when they have done something they were not fully told the implications of, and the reality is now sitting in front of them in the form of a vampire who has been alive since the Black Death. Lenora spent those same 4 hours in Gideon's study, which she had taken to treating as partially her own, going through the documents that Gideon's court archivist, an elderly and meticulous vampire named Breath, brought her, cross-referencing the Conclave rules with the evidence they were assembling. She was building the case. She was doing it with the same methodical intensity that she brought to a complicated trauma case, constructing a logical argument from physical evidence and procedural code. When Gideon came to find her at 3 a.m, she was sitting in his chair, surrounded by documents, the lamplight turning her hair to amber, and she looked up at him with something in her expression that was softer than her usual clarity. "Did you get what you need from him?" she asked. "Yes." "Is Perovich dealt with?" "Yes." She exhaled, not a sigh of exhaustion, something more complicated. "Good." She looked at the documents around her. "I think I have the structure of the declarance argument. Breath has been helping me understand the procedural format." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk and looked at what she had assembled. It was meticulous. It was exactly right. It was better, in several structural respects, than what he would have built on his own, because she thought in systems and patterns in a way that complemented how he thought in precedence and power. "You did not have to do this," he said. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "Yes, I did. This is my protection, Gideon, not just yours. You signed a contract that says my safety is your responsibility, and I am choosing to be someone who takes responsibility for their own safety too. This is how I do that." He looked at her for a long time. "I should tell you something," he said. "I know you should." The lamplight between them was quiet and warm. "What I said in the car?" he said, about preferring to lose the Conclave seat. I heard you. I want you to understand what I was saying. She looked at him with the particular attention she gave things she was taking seriously. I understand what you were saying. I am a doctor. I am very familiar with what it looks like when someone means the most important thing they have ever said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I have been alive for 523 years. I know I have not felt this way in that time. Not once, she said very quietly. How long have you known? Since the night you arrived in my house and told me what supplies you needed with your hands inside a wound, possibly before that, but that is when I became certain. She stood up from the chair and crossed to where he sat on the edge of the desk, and she stood directly in front of him, and he could hear her heartbeat, which he always could, which had become one of the most essential sounds in his world, steady and vivid and alive. I need to say something, she said. Yes, I have thought about this carefully. I have considered the logic of it, the age difference, the nature of what you are, the practical complications of a formal relationship between a human and a court principal, the blood law implications. She paused. And I have thought about the way I feel when I am in this house, in this room with you, and none of the logical complications change the second thing. He stood and they were very close, and he looked at her in a way that had the full weight of 5 centuries behind it, which was considerable. Lenora. Gideon, she said in the exact same tone, which was slightly devastating. The conclave meets in 11 days, he said. I would prefer to deal with Saw before I say any of the other things I want to say. That's reasonable. But she was smiling, just slightly, the particular smile that she had that was small and real and not performed for anyone. But you're going to say them? Every single one, he said. They spent the next 10 days building something formidable together. Lenora took 2 personal days from the hospital, called in the favor she was owed by the department chief she had saved from a research scandal 2 years prior, and quietly redirected her emergency dispatch routing through Mirev House's communication system so that any calls to her personal line were screened before she acted on them. She was not cavalier about her safety. She was simply a person who calculated risk the same way she calculated dosages accurately, with appropriate caution and without excessive fear. She came to Mirev House every evening. Gideon found reasons to extend the evenings. Vaska found reasons to make coffee. Breath found reasons to bring historical documents that were genuinely interesting and required extended discussion. They talked about medicine and about the old courts and about the compact's original drafting, which Gideon had witnessed personally, having been 43 years old at the time of his transformation and therefore already deeply embedded in the political landscape of the late Victorian era. She asked him questions about those years, and he answered them fully, and she was genuinely fascinated, not in the way that people are sometimes fascinated by something that makes them uncomfortable, but in the way that an intelligent person is fascinated when history stops being abstract and becomes a living account. He asked her about medicine, and she lit up in a way that was different from her professional composure, warmer and more unguarded, and he paid close attention to every version of her he encountered. One evening, 7 days into the 11, she arrived with 3 boxes of archival files that Breath had lent her to review at home, and she spent 4 hours at the study table, and then fell asleep in Gideon's chair, surrounded by documents, her head tilted to one side, her breathing slow and even and steady. He sat in the opposite chair and watched over her, and did not find it unusual to be a 5-century-old court. Principal keeping watch over a sleeping human physician, because almost nothing about Lenora Belmont had turned out to be usual, and that was the most essential fact about her. When she woke up at midnight, slightly startled and immediately steady, she found him exactly where she had left him, reading a document with a cup of his own blood-based compound beside him, which was what he consumed instead of coffee, and she looked at him for a moment with the sleepiness still in her eyes and said, "You stayed." "Of course," he said, not looking up from the document, and then looked up, because she had gone quiet in the particular way that meant something important. She was looking at him with something on her face that she was not trying to hide. He set the document down. She said, "I am going to tell you something that is going to be very obvious, and probably something you already know. Tell me anyway. I think I have been in love with you since the 2nd week," she said, "and I have been waiting to say it until the situation was not actively life-threatening. But I have realized that there may never be a period where the situation is not actively life-threatening, because this is the world we are in, and I don't want to wait anymore." He was very still. "You should know," he said carefully, "that with vampires of my age and bloodline, this is not a thing that can be undone. This is not a feeling that passes or diminishes. If I tell you that I love you, I am telling you that I will love you for the rest of my existence. I want you to understand what that means before you say anything else." "I understand what that means," she said. "I am a person who does not make declarations she hasn't thought through. I have thought through this one thoroughly." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and took her face in his hands, carefully, with the full awareness of what he was, the absolute discipline of 5 centuries, folding itself into gentleness, and he looked at her. "Lenora Belmont," he said, I have been alive for 523 years, and I have never once believed that the world would give me something I would not know how to hold on to. I know how to hold on to you." She put her hands over his. "Then hold on." He kissed her with the same quality of certainty that he brought to everything, completely, without reservation, with the full weight of 5 centuries and an absolute conviction about what mattered most. And she kissed him back with the warmth and courage and total honesty. That was the truest thing about her. They stood in the lamplight of his study for a long time, and the city moved above them and around them, and did not notice, because the city never noticed the extraordinary things happening in its depths. The conclave of seals met in a location that no GPS system recorded and no public record acknowledged, a chamber in the oldest level of a private building in the Gold Coast that had been maintained by rotating vampire court agreements since 1887. The chamber was all dark stone and candlelight, which was traditional rather than necessary, the vampire courts having adopted modern lighting long ago, but preferring tradition for formal occasions. The seals of 12 courts hung from the ceiling in glass cases. The principals and their seconds sat at a curved table of black walnut that was genuinely older than the city above it. Gideon entered the chamber with Vasca at his left and Lenora at his right. There was a notable pause in the room when she walked in. The presence of a human at Conclave was not unprecedented, but it was very old precedent, and the human in question was usually someone with decades of formal court contract behind them. Lenora had 19 days. She was wearing black, not because it was required, but because she had chosen it, and she wore it with the same authority she wore her physician's coat. Dravek Sor was at the far end of the table. He was ancient in the way that made age visible as power, rather than decay, white-haired and white-skinned like all elder vampires, but with a particular quality of stillness that was calculated to communicate absolute sovereignty. He had attended conclaves since before the American Civil War. He had outlasted 6 Mirev principles. He looked at Gideon's entrance with an expression of absolute composure. His eyes moved to Lenora. Something shifted very slightly in his composure. Gideon saw it. He had been watching for it. Saw had expected Lenora to be dead or absent. The hospital operative had failed, and Perovich's channel was closed, but Saw was good enough at court maneuvering to have anticipated this possibility. What he had not anticipated was Lenora being present, formal, composed, and carrying under her arm the documentation package that she and Gideon had spent 10 days building. The conclave opened with the formal reading of the session agenda, which was conducted by the conclave's presiding archivist, an extremely old and extremely careful vampire named Seldine, who had held the archivist position for 140 years and treated the compact with the reverence of something genuinely sacred. When the agenda reached the compact renewal vote, Gideon stood. "I invoke the declarance of challenge," he said, "against the Vethrani court and its principal, Dravek Saw. Under the provision established in the original compact text, Article 7, Section 3, I present evidence of deliberate bad faith manipulation of the compact's protection codes with the intent to destabilize conclave representation and force a procedurally illegal alteration to the compact's renewal terms." The chamber was very quiet. Saw's composure did not crack, but it recalibrated. The evidence package was presented. Gideon presented the legal framework. Lenora presented the medical evidence, because the presence of a Vethrani preparation compound in a hospital setting obtained under false pretenses was a violation of the compact's human world concealment clauses as well as its protection provisions, and she presented it with the clarity and precision of someone who testified in professional and legal contexts regularly and knew exactly how to make technical information comprehensible to a room that needed to make a decision. Saw's response was sophisticated. Of course it was. He argued that the operative had acted outside official court sanction, that the preparation compound's presence was circumstantial, that the declarant's standard of proof required more than a field operative's testimony, and a single compromised court member. Lenora placed one additional document on the table. It was a blood-sealed communication order recovered from Perovich's encrypted files, written in Saw's formal court hand and bearing his seal, directing Perovich to supply the operative with Lenora Belmont's schedule and confirming that the operation was authorized at the highest Vethrani level. In 500 years of conclave proceedings, blood-sealed communications bearing a principal's direct seal had never been successfully argued away. The chamber voted. The declarance was upheld, 9 votes to 3, the 3 dissenters being Vethrani-aligned courts, who were also under review, and who knew it. Dravek Saw's conclave seat was suspended, pending a full formal tribunal, and the Vethrani court's voting rights in the compact renewal were removed for the current session. The compact renewal passed with all remaining seats in agreement. Saw stood from the table. He looked across the chamber at Gideon, the look of a man who has played a long game and seen it end, not with collapse, but with a door closing that has no lock on his side. He looked at Lenora. The look was not threatening. It was something more considered. The assessment of someone who had underestimated the human factor and was filing the error away for future study. Then he inclined his head, very slightly, which was the formal acknowledgement of defeat within the Conclave rules, and he left the chamber. Gideon exhaled. Lenora, standing beside him, said quietly, "That's done, then. That specific form of it." He agreed. Saw is not finished as a political force, but he has lost his ability to threaten the compact for a generation, and he has lost the legal mechanism to threaten you. She nodded. She looked at the seal of the Mirev bloodline hanging in its glass case at the far end of the chamber, one of the oldest seals in the collection, and she looked at it with an expression that was thoughtful and new. "Come back with me," he said. She looked at him. "To Mirev House?" "Yes." He picked up the documentation case. "And then, perhaps, we should discuss the less formal matters I promised to address." The small smile appeared. "Every single one," she reminded him. Mirev House in the small hours of the morning was warm and quiet. The lower levels lit by the deep amber of the recessed fixtures that Gideon had chosen when he renovated the space in 1998. Choosing light that was warm rather than clinical because he had centuries of experience living in beautiful things and understood the value of warmth. Vasca had returned ahead of them and had, inexplicably and without being asked, left a fresh pot of coffee on the kitchen counter beside 2 cups. Lenora poured herself one. She leaned against the kitchen counter and held the cup and looked at him. "The blood law," she said. "Yes. Walk me through the formal structure of what a permanent court alliance with a principal means. All of it. Not the simplified version." He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at her. He had known this conversation was coming and had been running it in his mind for several days. A contracted visitor relationship is time-limited and can be dissolved by either party, he said. It offers protection, but not court standing. You would remain fully human in the eyes of the Conclave, and your safety would always be conditional on my court's political stability. He paused. A formal court alliance, what the old codes call a blood accord, is different. It is a permanent bond. Under its terms, you would hold court standing equivalent to a junior principal. Your safety becomes a compact-level guarantee, not just a Mirev obligation. Any court that moved against you would be moving against the entire compact structure. She was listening with her full attention. "The blood accord does not require transformation," he continued. "That is a common misunderstanding. It does require a formal vow before the Conclave, witnessed and sealed, and it carries obligations on both sides. I would be bound to your protection, absolutely and permanently. You would be bound to the court's confidentiality and code of honor." "And the personal dimension," she said. The blood accord in its original formulation was designed for court alliances between bloodlines. It has been used in recorded history for personal bonds as well, but not frequently. The last recorded use for a personal bond between a principal and a human was in 1743. What happened? They were together until her death, he said quietly. 43 years. She held her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment. "And you? What would 43 years be to you?" He looked at her with the full honesty that he had decided 19 days ago in his kitchen was the only way he would ever be with her. Irreplaceable. Every year, every day. She set the coffee cup down. She crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table across from him, and she leaned forward on her elbows and looked at him with those clear and formidable eyes, and said, "I am 32 years old, actuarially. I have roughly 50 more years ahead of me, barring the unexpected, which, given our recent experience, may be a significant caveat, to spend those years doing meaningful work. I want to keep practicing medicine. I want to be fully, honestly, completely myself." She paused. "And I want to do all of that here, and with you. I want the blood accord. Not because it offers me political protection, though I understand its value. Because it is what this is." He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him and held on. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this life is different from what you had before, that there are dangers and obligations and constraints. I was already in danger before I met you. I already had obligations. I already worked within constraints." She looked at him with the steady warmth that had been quietly remaking something deep inside him since the first night. "The difference is that the life I have now has you in it. That is not a constraint. That is a fact I am extremely glad of." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, the hands of a surgeon, capable and careful and built for saving lives. And he looked at them with the full awareness of what he was choosing and what he was offering. "I am going to love you for the rest of your life," he said. "And then I am going to carry the memory of you for the rest of mine. I will hold it as the most important thing I have ever been given." She squeezed his hand. Her eyes were bright. "That's a very long love story," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I am entirely committed to it," she laughed, which was the sound that he had already decided was one of the finest things in any world, vampire or human, and he held her hand in the warm kitchen light, and the city continued its indifferent and beautiful existence above them, and everything, for the first time in 5 centuries, felt like it was exactly where it was meant to be. The formal blood accord vow was taken at the next conclave session, 2 weeks later, in the same chamber where the declarants had been upheld. Seldine presided with the gravity of someone who was genuinely moved by the occasion, which, for a vampire who had witnessed the original compact signing, was significant. The conclave members who were present witnessed it according to the ancient rite, the vow spoken in the original covenant language, the seal pressed in the old way, witnessed and recorded in the compact's permanent archive. Lenora spoke her part of the vow without hesitation and without looking away from him. And the formal language, which was very old and very serious, and which she had spent a week memorizing with the same intensity she brought to learning complex surgical protocols, sounded in her voice like something that had always been true, and was now simply being acknowledged aloud. He spoke his part with the full weight of 523 years behind it, and every word was exactly, completely, irreversibly meant. In the months that followed, Lenora continued her work at the hospital. She continued her street medicine on nights when the situation allowed, though she now had a discreet escort that she had negotiated to be genuinely unobtrusive rather than hovering, because she was Lenora Belmont, and she had standards for how her independence was respected even in its protection. Dresch, the lower court member, whose life she had saved in that alley, on the night everything began, recovered fully and became, in the particular way that genuine gratitude sometimes evolved in court culture, one of her most quietly loyal advocates. He did not make a formal thing of it. He simply began appearing in locations where she might benefit from a steady presence, and she appreciated that without making a formal thing of it either. The Severance Glass was examined by Breath and 2 other Mirev archivists in the weeks after the conclave. The crack that had appeared when Gideon looked into it and saw Lenora's fate remained, running from the upper left corner to the lower right in a clean diagonal. Breath's studied opinion, rendered after considerable examination and 3 weeks of historical review, was that a cracking mirror indicated a resolved vision, an outcome that had been definitively altered, sealed and closed by the choices made in the aftermath of the seeing. The crack does not damage the glass, Breath reported, with the precision of someone who had studied the artifact for longer than most nations had existed. It is not destruction, it is a record of change, a mark of something that was written and then unmade. Gideon stood in the chamber of glass and looked at the cracked mirror for a long time. The reflection showed nothing now except what was actually in the room, which was himself. And after a moment, Lenora coming to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the fractured surface, she looked at the crack. She looked at their reflections, side by side. She slipped her hand into his. "It showed you your worst fear," she said. "Yes, and I was already there, yes." She looked at their reflections for a moment. The pale, white-haired, ancient vampire principal and the dark-eyed human physician standing beside each other in the fractured glass, and she said quietly, "I like this version of the reflection better." He looked at her in the mirror. She looked back. "So do I," he said. He turned from the mirror and looked at her directly, her face and not its reflection, the real thing, the living, warm, extraordinary real thing, and he pulled her gently toward him and kissed her forehead. And she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has found where they belong. Above them, the city breathed its ordinary breath. Traffic moved on streets that did not know about the things beneath them. The old courts, and the ancient vows and the fractured mirror in its iron frame, the documentation of a love that had been signed and witnessed and sealed in the oldest chamber in the city. Below, the city in a house that was older than most of what surrounded it. They stayed. In the years that followed, the Mirev court gained a reputation in the careful and whispered networks of vampire society, as the court with the human doctor, which was said in several tones depending on who said it. Some of the old courts said it dismissively, which was their right and their limitation. Some of the newer courts, the ones led by vampires who had been transformed in the modern era and who thought in modern terms, said it with the particular interest of people who recognized that something was shifting in the old structures. Lenora did not particularly care about her reputation in vampire court society. She cared about her patients, her work, her ongoing attempt to document the medical parameters of vampire physiology in a form that could be used to improve treatment outcomes for court members in crisis, and about the specific vampire principal who had been watching over her since the night she refused to leave a dying man in the rain. She and Gideon moved through the world with the ease of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and full intention, and did not feel the need to apologize for it. They disagreed with some regularity, because they were both precise and opinionated, and she had a particular habit of identifying the flaws in arguments he was emotionally invested in, which he had learned to appreciate, even when it was inconvenient. He had a particular habit of arranging for her safety in ways that were occasionally excessive, and which she pointed out with a specificity that was both accurate and slightly amusing, and he adjusted, because she was always right about where the line was. They talked about everything, about medicine, and about the old courts, and about the city above them, and about history that he had witnessed firsthand, and about the future, which was complicated and uncertain, and which she approached with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything else. The question of the future was the one that had the most open edges. She raised it herself one evening in the 2nd year, sitting in the study with a glass of wine and a document from the Mirev archives that she had been reading. Setting the document down and looking at him with the expression that meant she had been thinking about something for a while. "The blood accord doesn't change my biology," she said. "No," he agreed. "So we have the time we have. Yes, and you have the time after that, which is effectively forever. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I have thought about this, and I am at peace with it. I am not going to pretend the gap doesn't exist, because it does. But I am not afraid of it. I intend to use every year I have as fully as possible, and I intend to spend them here, and the fact that you will continue after me is something I hold with sadness, and also with a kind of fierce gladness, because it means that what we have will be remembered, and I think that's enough." He sat very still. She looked at him. "Unless, there is no unless," he said carefully. "Unless there is." She set down her glass. "Transformation exists. I am a physician. I have studied your physiology extensively. I understand the process and its implications, at least from a medical standpoint. The decision to transform a human is not made lightly. It is not reversible. It changes everything, not merely biology. You would be bound to the court in different ways. You would carry the weight of this existence in full. I know. It is also not something I would ever press you toward. Not once. Not ever." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to press me. I'm asking you to tell me honestly whether you would be willing." He held her gaze for a long time. "If you asked me," he said slowly, "having fully understood and made the decision freely and without any pressure from any quarter, having taken all the time you needed, having spoken to every person whose counsel you value, including counsel outside my court, including Vaska, who would have very thorough opinions on the matter, and share them at great length, if after all of that you asked me, then yes." He paused. "Yes, I would do anything you asked of me." She picked up her wineglass again. She looked at it thoughtfully. "I'm going to take some time with this," she said. "Take all the time you need. That could be years. I have years," he said, and the smile that had been threatening arrived fully. "I have considerable years. Take them." She smiled at her wineglass and did not say anything else about it that evening, and he did not either, and that was exactly right. Vaska did, in fact, have very thorough opinions. He shared them over the course of several separate conversations, all of them weighted and careful and ultimately supportive, because Vaska had watched Lenora Belmont arrive in Mirev House with her hands inside a wound and her jaw set like iron, and he had recognized from that moment that she was someone who would hold what she carried and carry it well. In the 3rd year, on a January evening that was cold and beautiful, in exactly the way Chicago Januaries could be, walking along the lakefront with the skyline lit behind, manned, the water black, and moving beside them, Lenora stopped and looked at the city for a moment, and then looked at Gideon and said, "So I've decided." He looked at her. "I want the years I have," she said. "All of them, human, fully myself. Fully what I am, fully in this work I love, and I want them here, and I want them with you. And when they are done, I want to have done enough that what comes after feels earned." She paused. "That's my answer." He looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, and he said, "That is an answer that I love you for." She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the edge of the lake and looked at the city that contained, if you knew where to look, a house older than most of its streets, and in that house a cracked mirror in an iron frame that had once shown the worst thing a 5-century-old vampire could imagine, and had also, in the same moment, shown him that the person he loved was already standing there, refusing to accept the outcome, asking what needed to be done. He looked at the city, he thought about the mirror. He thought about what it had shown him, and what it had not been able to prevent from becoming something else entirely. He thought about Lenora Belmont, who had come into his world sideways and without apology, and had changed everything about what the word home meant to him. "I love you," he said. She squeezed the arm around her shoulders. "I love you too, thoroughly, and with full knowledge of what that means." He laughed quietly into the January cold. She tilted her head up to look at him, her dark eyes lit by the city light, her face open and warm and entirely herself. "Every single one," she said, reminding him of a promise that he was intending to spend the rest of her life keeping. "Every single one," he agreed. The city moved above them and around them and did not stop, and they stood at the edge of the beautiful ordinary world and the secret world beneath it, and in both of them they were exactly, completely, permanently where they belonged. The Severance Glass stayed in its chamber. The crack in its surface caught the light when the lamps were lit, a clean diagonal line from one corner to the other, a record of the worst fear that had been seen and faced and answered on its surface every time Gideon passed through the chamber. It showed only what was actually there, which, increasingly, was both of them, reflected, together steady and certain, in the fractured and permanent light.